Herkese tekrardan merhaba. Ben müsaadenizle bugünkü buluşmamıza e, bir giriş niteliğinde kısa bir konuşma yapmak, sizlere teşekkür etmek isterim. Öncelikle sorulardan başlayayım. Herkese tekrardan merhaba. Bugün burada olmanız bizler için çok değerli. Öncelikle sorulardan başlamak istiyorum. Evet, kayıt alacağız. Evet, kaydımızı daha sonra paylaşacağız sizler için. Öncesinde kısa bir konuşma yapmak ve sonra sözü Sayın Doktor Peri'ye bırakmak istiyorum. Müsaadenizle başlıyorum. Ben Mader Bengisu Bilgen, Zahmudist Hastanesi'nde görev alıyorum. Burada eğitim sorumlusuyum. Ve değerli katılımcılarımız sizler ve Sayın Doktor Peri, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Ülkemizde yaşanan depremde hayatını kaybedenlere rahmet, yaralılara acil şifalar dileyerek sözlerime başlamak isterim. Bu zor günlerde birlikte olmanın gücüne inanıyor ve Moody's ailesi olarak sizleri ağırlamaktan dolayı onur duyuyoruz. Bugün burada bizlere destek olmak için bulunan Doktor Peri'ye ve sevgili ekibine çok teşekkür ederim. Herkese verimli bir oturum dilerim. Doktor Peri, lütfen buyurun.
First of all, thank you for asking us to share some of our thoughts with you. I mean, I have been involved in a lot of tragic incidents and terrible situations where communities have been impacted by violence or natural disaster, and it's always it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways because there's a certain degree of helplessness that many people feel when we're trying to help. And that helplessness is something that is experienced by people at every level of exposure to the event. So even the people who have lost family members, the people who are professionals in those communities, the people who are Turkish people all over the world, all have a sense of how can we help? What can we do? And so, first of all, I just want to say I don't want to pretend that I have any magical understanding that's any greater than what you already know. But I am part of a very large community of clinicians and professionals who have experience working with people and communities following tragic events. So what I would like to do, and we can talk about this a little bit, but what I really want to do is see how our community of professionals can be of service to your community of professionals. And I think that the best way to do that is to have not just a one-time presentation, but I would like to suggest, and you don't have to do this, but I think that it would be most helpful to think about having some kind of ongoing opportunity to have professional development experiences to draw upon both expertise in Turkey, because there are people that have a lot of expertise in Turkey with PTSD, with trauma after natural disasters. And then there are people outside of Turkey that are part of our community who know a lot about traumatic grief, who know a lot about the lifelong journey that many of your friends and family and countrymen will go through following this just tragic earthquake. So we can talk more about this, but I want people to think about this as an introductory presentation. So there's more to come. And I have a lot of different ideas about how to start this. And let me just sort of give a little bit of a heads up. I'm sure that there are lots of people who are going to have questions or ideas about issues, and I probably won't get to all of the stuff that we could talk about in the next 50 minutes or so. But I also want to introduce, and we do this a lot in all of our work, I want to introduce and reinforce the concept of dosing and spacing. And when we talk about that, basically what we're meaning is that when you're dealing with either the acquisition of new concepts, learning new things, or dealing with the intensely emotional things, you can only do so much at a time. And so what I want to do is sort of develop a good pacing to how we try to help you all and how we introduce some of these new ideas, and kind of lay a groundwork to some of the core concepts that we'll return to again and again and again. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm very dependent upon my slides. So I'm going to switch to slides now. And so those of you, this is what I look like. That's all I got, sorry. But I'm going to turn into a bear, and then I'm going to show my slides. All right. That's the bear. And here are the slides. Now, one of the things that I hope will happen in this, in our evolving relationship, is that you will all help us translate some of the content that we have into Turkish so that it can be used in your communities for people who are not Turkish, who don't speak English. But for those of you who do read English or are familiar with English, and there are some places that you could get some potential helpful content. These are our websites where we have a lot of articles and things that you may be helpful. There's some here. We have a YouTube channel, which actually some of you are watching this presentation on a live stream there. We have a lot of archived and recorded content there that is in English. But again, as I said, possibly through this partnership, we can begin to identify content that is particularly useful that you may want to use for the communities impacted by this event. We've done this with people who are managing some of the Ukrainian refugees and some of the people who've been impacted by that, and they've translated some of the basic psychoeducational information about traumatic death, about talking about trauma to parents and so forth, and that's been very helpful. So maybe we can do some of that. We'll identify some materials that maybe will be helpful for you. So let me start with this slide. I think everybody who's listening has had some exposure to teaching and learning about stress, about distress, about trauma. And what I want to start with, and what we'll return to again and again and again, is a little bit of appreciation about the different patterns of stress that lead to either high vulnerability and problems or healing and ultimately resilience. So, first of all, the way we think about stress and the way I think about stress is kind of from the perspective of a biologist. And that's because I was trained as a neuroscientist, and I think about stress and stressors from this basic physiological perspective. And again, I suspect many of you know some of this and know a lot of this already. So I apologize if this is redundant. But one of the things that we've tried to do over the years is take a perspective on all of the sort of behavioral and emotional issues related to trauma that is really using the brain. So we tend to use an understanding of the brain as one of the important perspectives for understanding human behavior. And the reason is we really, we believe that the brain has systems that are responsible for thinking, feeling, moving, et cetera, et cetera. And so we think that the more we know about the brain, the better off we'll be in figuring out ways to influence those systems to result in positive outcomes. So the problem is, and we're going to, everybody, again, appreciates this. The problem is the brain's very complex and is not yet particularly well understood. Now, there are certain things about the brain that we know very, very well, and there's certain things about the brain that we have yet to discover. But one thing that we do know about the brain is that it is almost infinitely complicated, which leaves us with a little bit of a challenge that if we really want to understand the brain and we want to teach about the brain and teach those things that we do know about the brain, we have to figure out simpler ways to talk about it. And one of the things that we've done to simplify our teaching about the brain is to come up with what we call a heuristic. It's a model. And so I'm going to use a different version of this upside down model quite a bit when I teach about stress, distress, trauma, and so forth. So first simple thing, the brain is organized in a hierarchical fashion. There's the top part of our brain right up here, and then there's the bottom parts of our brain. And the lower parts of our brain are fundamentally focused on regulation of these core physiological systems. And these systems organize early in life. So a newborn baby has a brain that's organized really in the lower areas of the brain, and they can kind of control temperature regulation and blood pressure. But the higher parts of the brain that are involved in speech and language and all of that stuff, they're not yet organized. They're the precursor systems are present, but they're not yet organized. So an important thing to remember about the brain is that as you look at this hierarchical model, this sort of image that we use to talk about it, and you get higher and higher in the brain, you get into more and more complex functions. So neural networks in the middle part of the brain start to play a really important role in reward and pleasure and attachment and bonding and memory, and as the brain develops and organizes, and you start to develop these higher functions. And the higher you get in the brain, the more you get to what we consider the uniquely human parts of our functioning: speech and language, the capacity to develop complex value systems, the capacity to reflect on the past and anticipate the future. And this is the cortex. And again, I apologize if this is overly simplistic, but this will make some sense, I hope, in a minute. So what we know about the brain is that it's organized in this hierarchical way. There's a bottom, there's a middle, there's a top. The top parts of the brain are involved in complex cognition and thinking and planning and all of that kind of stuff. Now, we also know that the brain, with that structure, has some very, very, very important basic neural networks, basic systems that are involved in stress and regulation and all kinds of other functions. But these core regulatory networks, and again, you've heard of these. Most people have heard of these. Most people learn about these in, college. And these are such common systems that they're even talked about in the popular literature, in general literature. The general population, people have heard of dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine and adrenaline. So in the lower parts of our brain, we have these core regulatory networks that collectively will reach every part of the brain and go out into every part of the body. And they go directly to the body through the autonomic nervous system, and they indirectly through the neuroendocrine and the neuroimmune systems. And another really important part of this architecture, of the microarchitecture of your brain, is that all of our sensory input are what we see, what we hear, what we taste. All of that comes into the lower parts of the brain. Now, this is really an oversimplification, but the point is that the sensory apparatus from the inside of our body, interoception, where we are in space, how much oxygen we have, do we have enough fluid, all of that is continually feeding back into these core regulatory networks down here. And everything that's coming in from the outside is going here. And then depending upon the nature of the signals, this kind of, these grand central station will orchestrate what gets turned on, what gets turned off, what do we need to do? Do we need to go to sleep? Do we need to wake up? Do we need to get food? Do we need to get water? This is a very central and important part of our brain. And it really, because of this organization, this is the backbone of the stress response. So if the stressor is hunger, you don't have enough food, that will get communicated to this lower part of the brain, and we will go and get something to eat. If the external stressor is, you see some external threat, it might be somebody's angry at you, it might be somebody's yelling at you, that information comes in here, and then this part of the brain will mobilize what it needs to mobilize and get you prepared to meet that demand. And your brain does this all the time, all day long. Your brain, your stress response systems are activated in one way or another, and then they send signals about adaptation and adjustment and coping, and then you respond to that in a way that's appropriate, and you get back to your homeostasis, hopefully. Now, the problems can occur when those systems, so in general, we shouldn't be afraid of stress. Stress is not necessarily in and of itself bad. Stress is actually what helps us grow. Stress is what builds resilience. Stress is what builds our strength. When you stress your muscles and you lift weights, which is a stressor, you actually, if you do it the right way, the right pattern, builds strength. If you go running upstairs and you do this again and again and again, you are stressing your cardiorespiratory system in ways that will build strength. This is something that's good. The problem is when your stress response system is activated in a prolonged way or in a pattern where there's no controllability and everything's unpredictable, then that puts a burden on these core regulatory networks that makes them try to adapt to the challenge. And in the process of making these adaptations, you will change the normal stress reactivity curve. Now, let me just show you this. This is a chart that we use to help teach about what we call state dependence. What's your internal state? Are you calm, alert, alarm, fear, terror? And then what's your personal reactivity curve? So if you're lucky enough to have your core regulatory network set in a way that it has a proportional response to external challenge, you'll have a moderate stressor. Let's say that you have to give a presentation. It will activate systems in your brain that allow you to be active and alert and focused on whatever the threat is. But if you have had a sensitizing set of experiences, your brain will have adapted and changed those core regulatory networks so that even a moderate stressor results in a activation internally that makes your brain act as if you're under stress. And so let me walk you through this for 1 second. Again, I apologize. I mean, I suspect that many of you already know most of this stuff, and I apologize if it's redundant, but I just kind of want us all to start on the same page about this. So here, let's go back to this model. Here's our core regulatory networks. These systems are kind of continually getting input, deciding what to do. Am I safe? Is this familiar? Is this new? Is this, do I have enough to eat? Am I hungry? Am I cold? All of that's coming in, and you're responding to that depending upon what's coming in. And so if information comes in that says you're under threat, it will activate your core regulatory networks. And two really important things happen. Number one, you will activate other parts of your body and brain that will help you deal with whatever the threat is. So for those of you who are sort of neuroscience geeks, down here, think about the locus ceruleus and the median raphe and all of those nuclei down here. And this part up here, this is the amygdala. That gets activated when these systems get a signal of threat. And then there are certain parts of the cortex that get activated. And so there's an activation that takes place under threat. But there, most importantly, however, there is a shutdown of other parts of the brain and body that your brain basically is making the judgment that I don't need to think about the past right now because I have to deal with the saber-toothed tiger. I don't need to think about where I'm going to go on vacation because the house is on fire. I need to act right now. I don't need to think. I don't need to reflect on things. So what happens is the top part of the brain, by and large, under threat, starts to get shut down. Now, remember, if you have a pattern of activation that's persistent and prolonged and extreme, your set point starts to change. And so when you start to change your baseline level of arousal, because you've been like this a lot, what that means is that at baseline, when you are going through the day, rather than being in a situation where you have a lot of the higher parts of your brain open, a lot of the relational empathic parts of your brain, a lot of the parts of your brain involved in memory and remembering and retrieving, the parts of your brain involved in complex cognition and thinking and so forth, all of these are open when you are calm and alert. And I can guarantee you right now, the vast majority of people who are directly involved in the earthquake and in the response to the earthquake and had family involved in it and lost family, they're not in this state. They don't have full access to their cortex. It's highly likely that more of them are feeling dysregulated. It's more likely that most of them are feeling physically exhausted, cognitively basically foggy, They can't think and solve problems the same way that they were able to previously. So here they are facing these problems that are almost incomprehensible, and their own internal capacity to solve problems is compromised because of the state of dysregulation. And we'll come back and talk about some of the implications of that in a minute. But let's talk a little bit more about what happens under these conditions. So, if you are lucky enough to have a developmental history, let's say prior to the earthquake or whatever the circumstance is, you are lucky enough to have work and a job and stable housing and connected to community, safe and stable community and family. By and large, the accumulation of experiences in your life would have shifted your vulnerability resilience curve in the direction of resilience, because you would have had more controllability, more predictability, more moderation in your life experiences. But there will also be people in the community that have more vulnerability. There will have been more people in these communities impacted even prior to the earthquake who have been impacted by fragmentation or domestic poverty or unemployment or homelessness or all kinds of other stressors. And this population, when you're starting to look at community problem solving, you're going to find that prior to the earthquake, there were individuals and families that were in this highly vulnerable group, and there were individuals and families that are in the more resilient group. It doesn't matter. Both groups are going to be experiencing traumatic experiences and need attention. But you need, for those of you who are planning and thinking about how do we respond to this, this is something that is going to be part of the problem-solving process, is that you will find over time that the individuals that are impacted more profoundly by this are individuals who were either more directly impacted or individuals who had pre-existing vulnerability. So let me, and again, this is sort of, this may not be the greatest slide here, and I have some others that I'll show later on. But one of the things that we know is that if you have a group of individuals start here, time one, and let's say this is, you're looking at a couple of different individuals over time. If you're lucky enough to grow up and be born into a family where there's community connection and there's opportunities for education and there's cultural connection and you have relational health and you have the everyday stressors and challenges of education and work, you end up being on this trajectory. And then when a catastrophic event happens, this group, even though they have had all kinds of positive things happen, they're going to be challenged. Now, I don't know where this curve is going to go. This curve will go, it could go all the way up into the sensitized region over time. But if you start down here, you will have an easier time dealing with whatever the catastrophic event is. On the other hand, as I said before, if you are in a vulnerable population and you had pre-existing vulnerability, and then along comes a traumatic event, you are basically in this highly sensitized, highly symptomatic, easily overwhelmed category. And so the first point I really want to make here, and I'm going to change, I'll come back and to this in 1 second, but I'm going to stop this. And then I'm going to stop sharing slides, and I want to share a whiteboard. No, I don't want to do that. I want to share. Yeah, that's what I want to share. Hopefully you could, do you see like a blank whiteboard page? Okay, good. So here's what I want you to start thinking about. And this is one of the big, different people are going to be involved in this in different ways. But if you're involved in the response to the communities, part of what you need to begin to do is organize your thinking along the lines of categories of risk. And so the way I do this, and the way I've done this, we did this at 9/11, we've done this after school shootings, we've done this after other natural disasters. You begin to think about the situation in a two-dimensional way. Now the two-dimensional way is just the beginning. So in the middle of this two-dimensional sort of image of risk is sort of ground zero. This is the group of people who were either physically injured in the earthquake, who were in the earthquake and had family die, had family members, loved ones who were immediately impacted. And outside of that group, you're going to have, now, from what little I know, this group is going to include hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I don't know the death toll, but I would suspect if you looked at the number of individuals who had a loved one who was either injured or killed in the earthquake, it's going to be over 100,000 people. It might be a several 100,000 people. So what you have in your immediate group, this high-risk group right here, the risk that group has is something like 80% of these people are going to have significant mental health needs. They are very significantly going to have prolonged and profound grief. They have a high probability of developing trauma-related symptoms over time. This is a group that is really going to have a very hard time for a long time. Now, the second group out is, this group is, they've been impacted, but they may just be know of someone, but not have that be an immediate family member. It might be a coworker. It might be an acquaintance. It might be a friend's cousin. They might be best friends with somebody who lost a loved one. And so this is also a huge group. And the probabilities that you're in this group are going to be, and again, I'm giving you sort of a guesstimate. This group is going to have risk of significant mental health needs of about 60%. And in this secondary group, you have first responders, people who may be living outside and not been directly impacted, but who have to go and respond to try and immediately help the physical needs of the individuals who have been impacted. And so this is also a very big group of people. The third group out, oops, sorry, I gotta pick the right image here. The third group out is going to be individuals who lost homes, who lost jobs, who have economic insecurity, who may not have had the interpersonal loss, but have a loss of predictability, loss of structure, loss of employment, loss of material things. And this is also literally, you've got, this group is huge. And the risk for significant mental health challenges in that group is going to be, I would say, put it at 40%. And so when you start to do what we call the sociometric mapping, which I'm sure some of you have already started to think about, the task is almost overwhelming. And there's two parts to it. The two parts, the way I like to think about the response is that first of all, you have to think about the immediate fundamental needs of the people in each of these groups. What do they need? And let me just reassure you that they do not necessarily need mental health professionals to rush in. And one of the things that we've learned is that the most powerful buffer of present stress and stressors that will help you in both the immediate, the acute, and the post-acute period following trauma is the ability to reconnect and be connected to family, community of faith, community of culture, that anything that you do, any structural intervention that promotes relational connection and the natural rhythm of relational connection in those settings will lead to stabilization and opportunity over time to heal. And so the second variable that's really important, the first immediate is like, what's the relational milieu? What are the relational, what's the relational toolkit I have that I can bring to bear for this person or this family? The second thing is, what is the timeline going to look like? So when do I start thinking about mental health supports? And in contrast to a lot of the things that people, the natural tendency is to think about, when the need for supports is most acute and when it isn't. And it's very counterintuitive. So I think I made it. Here's a second page. I'm going to show you a plot of the way things happen in the US around big, high-profile disasters. And this is time. And I'm going to say this is 1 month. This is 3 months. This is 6 months. This is 1 year. And I'm going to show you our experience with the real need for advanced, developmentally sensitive, trauma-informed mental health services. Here's the real need for that. And I'm going to say that this is 100% of the people who have been impacted by the traumatic event. And I'm going to draw different curves, different risk curves, right? So there's the inner curve. Remember the inner curve? Here's the inner curve is going to be, that'll be group 1. And then the next group out is going to be 2. And then the next group to think about is group 3, right? They all are at risk, but they're going to have different trajectories. And I hope that makes sense. But so the people that are in the epicenter, sort of at ground zero of this traumatic event, they are going to deal with this by and large by using dissociation. They are in an inescapably painful and overwhelming situation. So they're going to be numb. They're going to use dissociation as much as they can. That's because that's basically that's the only option the brain has. You don't have a lot of other things. The fight or flight response is not helping them. So they can't get away from it. They cannot escape the traumatic loss and death. And again, a lot of you know a lot about dissociation, but that's the primary adaptive response that they use. They can only literally be present and fully face the horror of what's gone on. And I'm not exaggerating, for seconds. So they'll have seconds where they'll realize, oh my God, my child is dead, my child is gone. And it will be there in such an intense, overwhelming way that they will then collapse, and then they will use dissociation to kind of get through the next 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, next hour. And they'll robotically go through the motions of life. And that's, first of all, that's physically exhausting. And second of all, it is something that, here, maybe I should not be a bear here. I'll turn my video back on so that you can actually see me when I talk. So that's physically exhausting. And so in the beginning, the need for professionals to go in and spend time in our conventional sit and tell me about your trauma way is almost zero. So the need for these folks to get help from us is down here. Now, the help that they should get is us providing psychoeducational information and supports for people around them. We should give these people what information we have about the normal trajectory of trauma-related symptoms and issues following events. So it should be highly targeting the people around that epicenter. It should be targeting people that are in category 4, category 3, category 2, and category 1, giving them psychoeducational supports and helping them, giving them a sense that there is going to be a plan, because there's nothing more dysregulating than uncertainty and the unknown. Reassurance is as simple as saying, this feels like you want to die and like hell, and it's going to be horrible for a long time, but it will get better. It can get better. But there's nothing I can say or do right now that will take away the pain of this. Just that simple reassurance that there is a glimmer of hope is about all that we can do in this immediate period. And so what happens is that the need for more advanced mental health supports from this intergroup number 1 starts low, and it's mostly psychoeducational support, and then it starts to get a little bit higher, and then it gets a little bit higher, and then it gets a little bit higher, and it peaks at about 6 months. Now, I'm not saying they don't all need it, but this is sort of where the intensity is like this, and then it plateaus, and it persists. But now I want to show you, this is the way our mental health responders come into these situations. And I'm just talking about the inner group now, the people that are most impacted. Our mental health communities mobilize, and we send people come in from all over the place, and they want to talk to people, and they're present, and they want to tell the local press that they went and responded to the earthquake in Turkey, and they do all kinds of bullshit. And then after a couple of weeks, their actual ability to be present starts to diminish, because they've got to work, they got to get back home, they got to go back to their regular jobs. And so here's what happens. This is exactly what happens. The availability of mental health services collapses. Now, and the burden for all of this need, this burden falls on the local mental health community in that community. And as you may well know, very few communities have the mental health resources. Even in the United States, you go to the richest, you go to the most mentally health concentrated professional environment in the world, New York City. And after 9/11, if every single one of those mental health professionals was actually seeing people that needed help, they would have worked 100% with those clients, but they didn't, because those clients couldn't pay. And so if you have a traditional public mental health system that has a carrying capacity that is already overwhelmed, and then you add, 45% of the population has an acute need for mental health services, you're just going to overwhelm that system. So what happens is, this is the degree of care that is provided by the traditional mental health system. Now, that doesn't mean that the mental health system can't help. It just means that we can't use treatment practice as usual to meet the needs of these folks. We have to think differently. And we can talk about some of that stuff as we go. Now, if you go to the second group, the same thing happens. The need is, it literally parallels this, but it's a little bit less. And I'm just going to change the color a little bit here and to make the same point. They start about the same place, and they kind of have a parallel trajectory. And then it's the same thing. And then the third group is just like this. So there's demand in all of these groups. There's need. It's most acute in the inner group, and then the next group, and then the next group. But here's what you'll notice. It doesn't end at 1 year. This isn't going to be over in a year. This isn't going to be over in 2 years. For many of these folks, now, if certain kinds of things can happen in any of these groups, after the anniversary of the first year, there can be elements of resolution and shift, and the beginning of a growth that takes place. And I'm going to draw another thing in here, and I don't know if this is, again, I'm drawing this just because I want you all to have a little bit of hope. I don't want you to feel like it's hopeless. It's just a long, long, long process. So here we are. Here's year 2. Here's the end of year 1. Here's year 2. If you've got these folks right here, and they've been getting elements of therapeutic care, what begins to happen is that there's a little bit of an interesting little shift. There are fewer intrusive and significant, if you will, pathological issues. They're present. People still have some of these things, but part of what begins to grow is after a year, after the first year, people realize, wow, I've made it a year. And there's this interesting element of kind of like post-traumatic growth. And it starts little, but it starts to grow. And it starts to grow. And it starts to grow. And ultimately, over the years, there's a point of convergence where the post-traumatic growth actually gets a little bit, and now this is a lot of years, but ultimately what happens in all of these curves, if there is connection to community, if there's a little bit of little dosing of guided professional supports from the mental health community, not nonstop continuous mental health therapy, but a little bit of dosing of expertise and consultation, a little bit of support of what we call the therapeutic web, then you begin to see this. And again, I'm a really terrible artist, so I apologize. The symptomatic pathological part of the traumatic loss begins to diminish, and there is that little bit of a continuous growth of competence, of growth. You learn how to carry the load. The pain, the agony, the trauma doesn't go away, but you learn how to carry the load. And then there's this inflection, there's this transition point where you begin to have actually more strength than pain from the traumatic loss. And this is the beginning of wisdom. The people who live through these traumatic experiences, whether it's war, whether it's natural disaster, whether it's interpersonal violence, if you get away from it and you connect with people in your life that are caring and present and loving and compassionate, they don't have to be mental health professionals. But if that happens over time, people get to this place where there is a transition from permeating pain to a form of perspective and wisdom. And this is the hope. This is not going to destroy these communities permanently. These communities of people, these people can come together with our support, with the mental health community's support. They can come together, they can learn about what's predictable, what to do when something's getting in the way of sleep, how to identify when overwhelming depression needs more professional help. We can help them figure out when to pull in the limited mental health supports they need, but also encourage them and provide opportunities for them to build the therapeutic web of connections and relationships that will ultimately lead to long-term post-traumatic growth and healing. Now, a big part of this, of course, is this is a lot easier if there's economic supports to rebuild your house, to get a job, to get the appropriate health care to heal your broken limbs. So there's a parallel process that has to take place for this to ultimately take place with the speed that we want it to do. And of course, this little trajectory that I've drawn about, what's going to happen in these different curves and to these different people, this is going to vary depending upon the person, depending upon their individual history, depending upon their pre-existing vulnerability. But it's possible. It's absolutely possible. And one of the things that, let me stop sharing this way and go back to slides. Where is my, oh, there it is, sorry. I'm going to go back here for 1 second. We know that there are things that you can concretely do to shift your stress resilience curve in one direction or another. So if you start out and you are, in this neurotypical regulation thing because over the course of your personal life, you've had sort of a balance between the chaotic and the predictable. And now, if you do things like this, these things push you in this direction. So as all of you who are working either directly or indirectly with these families and communities, these are some of the things that can start to help push them back towards a more regulated state. And this one right here is where the psychoeducation part is so important. They need to understand that this is horrible. I'm not trying to undo how you feel. We're going to sit here in the darkness with you, but it's not always going to be this dark. Giving people a sense of hope is really important. Helping them create external structure and predictability. Let's get back to having meals together. Let's have exercise. Let's get kids back into school in whatever way we can. The more you create external structure, external predictability, external protocols, the more people can internally reorganize. And all of these things can be very, very helpful. One of the most powerful, of course, is ironically enough, one of the most neurobiologically regulating and rewarding things you can do when you are in need is to help somebody else who is in need. By helping others and being present for each other in these moments, both parties, both individuals will be helped. So anything that is involved in reaching out to help others will help that individual. And of course, these things, isolation is going to be toxic. Negativity ends up not being positive. If there's no structure, that makes things worse. There's a lot of things in this category that most of you all know that will make it harder to push people back towards this regulated state. And I have to say, I'm positive from our work and from looking at all of the work on social determinants of health and public health and population health data. The good news is you do not need doctoral level mental health people to heal. You do not need professionals to live through traumatic experiences. Humankind has had trauma and traumatic experiences and unpredictability and natural disasters for our entire history on the planet. And yet we've always managed to reweave social fabric, to restore humanity and health and compassion and connectedness. This is what will help us heal. Now, this process, as I said before, can be facilitated, it can be hurried, it can be encouraged and supported by people who have professional expertise like us. But in the end, what's going to help everybody is their ability to reconnect to the meaningful people in their lives, to the meaningful values in their lives, to their culture, to their aspects of their community. And obviously, within that broad, that big umbrella, there are lots of little areas that we can take a deeper dive and better understand, because you're going to have lots of kids that have really weird somatic symptoms. You're going to have lots of people who have unusual sensitization of their dissociative response, and you may have. I worked, for example, with people who were involved in Africa in the civil wars there, in the genocidal wars, that people were so dissociative and had such dissociative sensitization that they would hear a loud noise like a gunshot and they would literally faint and collapse. And it was completely mysterious to everybody but if you understand dissociation and sensitization of the stress response, it makes complete sense. It's the same. It's the same thing with a lot of other things that will be manifest and you're going to hear about. And what we can do as this series proceeds is we can take a deeper dive into some of these issues, talk a little bit more about dissociation, talk a little bit more about some specific both behavioral and cognitive and somatosensory regulatory activities that can be part of the healing package that you guys can help provide for your community and partners that are working with individuals in the community. So listen, I know I always talk too much. I'm sorry. So let me do this. I'm going to stop sharing this. I know it's late for you all, and I know that we had scheduled this for like an hour, but I think maybe it would be helpful to have a few questions and see if people had any reactions to what I was saying and any thoughts about this before we end. Yeah, why don't we do through chat? I mean, I obviously I'm not very good at reading Turkish. So if people have a few questions, I know we could probably do Q&A for a long time, but I just want to reassure people we're going to do this again, and we will have not just me, but there's a whole bunch of people that have expertise in our broader network who will be happy to come and share their expertise with all of you. And so we'll have lots of opportunities again to talk and meet. So if I don't get to your questions, be patient. So yeah, here's what I'll do. I will send to Mater. Is it Mater or Mater? 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 Is it Madash? Madash? Madash. Mada. Okay. All right. I will send a few of the materials that we've prepared previously for families and paraprofessionals who are working in sort of large-scale traumatic events, about traumatic loss, about how to talk to kids about traumatic loss. Just a few things that will be easy. Hopefully we can get these translated, and then we'll disseminate those to all of you. And then in terms of other reading, I have to say, you guys probably know a lot of this stuff already. If you know, I'll put together a little bit of a reading list, and we can send that out for things that I would recommend that people would read. I don't know how many of the things that I might recommend have been translated into Turkish, but we'll figure that out by email. Oh yeah, there you go. There's one thing. Yes, I'm trying to. Oh, there we go.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Sayın Peri. Ne kadar teşekkür edeceğimi gerçekten bilemiyorum. Kendi adıma değil, sadece tüm ülkem, tüm sizi dinlemeye bugün vakit ayırmış olan uzmanlarımız, vatandaşlar, bugün bizim için çok değerliydi sizi dinliyor olmak. E, Devamının da gelecek olması, bize böyle bir umut vermeniz çok değerli. Umarım yeniden bir araya geliriz. Defalarca kez sizi ağırlamaktan dolayı onur duyacağız. Emin olun ki ev sahipliği yapmak Mucit ailesi için çok değerli, çok kıymetli, size ve tüm katılımcılarımıza. E, Kaynaklar konusunda da çok memnun oluruz elbette. Hatta Türkçe çevirileri konusunda ciddi bir ekibimiz var burada. Oldukça çalışkan bir ekibimiz var. Buralarda biz size destek olmak isteriz. Daha önce de bir araya gelmeyi çok istemiştik. Maalesef böyle bizim için çok zor günlerde
Wonderful.
bir araya gelmiş olduk ama sizinle olmak yine de çok değerli, çok güçlendiren bir yerde. Sözlerimi çok uzatmak istemiyorum ama tüm oturum boyunca çok fazla teşekkür geldi. Sizinle olmaktan dolayı herkes çok memnundu. Bununla birlikte kayıt konusunu soran çok kişi oldu. Evet, kayıtları aldık ve paylaşacağız. Çevirileri de ekleyeceğiz. Ee, Belki sorusu olan kişilerin lütfen sadece
Exactly.
Sayın Peri'ye yönelik sorularınızı tek tek alabilir miyiz? Belki Sayın Peri siz okumak istersiniz. Ben Türkçe olanlarını okuyabilirim ve Halil Bey bize yardımcı olabilir çeviri noktasında belki. Herkes için anlaşılır olur diye ümit ediyorum bu şekilde.
Perfect. Why don't you go ahead and
Hı hı.
I see a few questions in English. One is about specific recommendations about how to
Lütfen
talk to
önden
children.
siz buyurun. Ben daha sonra Halil Bey sesini
Okay.
açar ve öylece okurum.
So the question I have is about explain a little bit about Africa and dissociation examples. So, and I'll send you some simple writings about these classic responses to stress. And so everybody knows, for example, about the fight or flight response, which is kind of the classic variant of adaptation that we learn about when we're learning about trauma. And that fight or flight response is your heart rate goes up and you kind of mobilize to get ready to defend yourself and that kind of thing. And that does happen under certain circumstances of stress. But there's a point where your brain basically goes, wait a minute, I'm not as big as a saber-toothed tiger, and I'm not fast as a saber-toothed tiger. And if this saber-toothed tiger gets me, it's going to bite me and I'm going to die. So I need to protect myself from injury, and I need to avoid the attention of the saber-toothed tiger. So I'm not going to move. And instead of pouring all my blood out to my muscles at 130 beats per minute, I'm going to slow down my heart rate. I'm going to release my own body's painkillers, opioids. I'm going to dissociate. I'm going to disconnect from the painful experience of watching a saber-toothed tiger gnaw on my arm. But that's going to increase the probability I survive. So what the brain has developed is basically a different form of coping with overwhelming stress, particularly when it involves pain, emotional pain or physical pain, that's unavoidable and inescapable. You can't run away from it. You can't hide from it. So you psychologically flee. So that dissociation is a partner of the fight or flight response, but it leads to different physiology and it leads to different behavior. And both of these systems can become sensitized if they're used too much. So if you are in a village in Africa that's been characterized by just this horrific form of warfare, where you're forced to watch your family shoot another member of your family, or you're forced to watch horrific events, and you can't do anything about it. Your brain dissociates. So one of the things that happens with dissociation is, I mentioned earlier, is that instead of having your heart rate go up and get ready to fight or flee, your heart rate goes down. So if you are standing and there's an evocative cue that reminds you of the situations that were horrific, it will precipitate a decrease in your heart rate as opposed to an increase, and you get lightheaded and faint. So fainting is a very common symptom of a profound dissociative response from somebody who has a history of being traumatized in a way that they couldn't escape. And so that's kind of what I was referring to. And we'll talk about this because you're going to see you will see a lot of dissociative behaviors in the people who have been impacted by this earthquake. Because, and one of the major misinterpretations by a lot of people that don't know about trauma is that a month later, they'll come back and they'll see the village and they'll see people walking around and they'll be appropriate and they won't be overly reactive and they won't be crying and they won't be wailing. And people go, oh, look at that. They've gotten over it. But they didn't. They've literally been so overwhelmed and it's so relentlessly painful that they've dissociated, and they're robotic in their responses, and they kind of are just going through the motions, and they have as much pain internally as they would if they were doing sort of this fight or flight response, you know. But when you do this external stuff where you're crying and clearly externalizing, people go, oh, that's so painful. That hurts so much. I can see that. I can feel that. But when somebody is robotically kind of like a zombie, people go, wow, look at that. You know, I can't believe that they're this functional after going through all of that stuff. But if you look carefully, they're just there's a lot of just kind of going through the motions. And you're going to run into a lot of that. That's going to be one of the biggest issues with government officials, with people that are coming in to help, is that we all want this to be better, right? We all want this to be better for those people. And it's hard to sit with the pain of all of that for a long period of time. So that's why the number of people that come in and want to help, that's why it just plummets after a little while. People come in and they feel this sense of helplessness, and then they leave. They go back to their regular work. They push it out of their minds. It's a defensive for them. And that's when they start talking about resilience. They're like, oh God, people are resilient, blah, blah, blah. They use resilience as sort of this emotional shield. In fact, a lot of those people they're calling resilient are dissociative. And anyway, that's kind of, I'm off on a tangent again. I'm sorry, I talk too much. I can do one more question, and then unfortunately I have to leave because I have to go to the doctor. Oh, Mother has a question.
Ben şöyle gelen soruları hepsini kontrol ettim, göz attım. Çok genel bir soru sormak istiyorum. Her bir soruyu toparlamak adına. E, Çocuklara yaklaşırken özellikle korktuğumuz bir nokta var ki deprem bölgesinde çoğu çocuk maalesef anne ve babasız kaldı. Birincil bakım verenlerini yitirdi. Dolayısıyla e, onların şu anki travma tepkilerini
Yeah.
görmek, hangi sürede ilk yardımı artık bir kenara koyup psikoterapi desteğine başlatmak, onları gözlemlerken özellikle hangi noktalara dikkat etmek gibi bir takım sorular var. Bunlar hakkında şöyle genel olarak belki bugünkü oturumu da toparlamak üzere bize bilgi verebilirseniz çok
I'll
mutlu olurum.
do a couple of ideas about that. We're dealing with the same thing with a lot of the Ukrainian refugees and children in the Ukraine. And we've dealt with this before in other situations. And there's a couple things. One is that we need to remember that these kids can only process this in little bits. So depending upon the age of the child, even if we do give them an explanation, you may actually sit down with a little 6-year-old child and say, I'm sorry, your mother was killed in the earthquake, and we're going to do all of this stuff and do whatever you think is right. And the next day, the child may come up to you and go, when is my mom coming home? And you're like, wait a minute, we already went through this. And so it's not going to be unusual that many kids will have a digesting process where they only can internalize part of it at a time. And over time, as it becomes more and more and more clear and obvious, you're going to see different manifestations of an intensity of their emotional response to it. So that's the first thing, is that I think you should be as compassionately open and truthful as you can, because there's nothing more important than trust in the end. And so tell the truth. You don't have to tell the details, but you just tell the truth. And then as they process it, you're going to have to revisit it again and again and again in different ways. And again, depending upon the age, you want to make two things are important. One is that you want to make sure that they understand that you can handle the emotional intensity and talk about it. Because a lot of adults, I've kind of been talking about this, the pain of this is so powerful, and human beings are contagious. So it's hard to sit with a kid who's expressing the pain of losing a parent. So we have a lot of techniques to undo that. Oh, it'll be fine, or whatever, you pat them on the back, or we'll take care of you, and your grandma's just like your mom, or whatever, language we use to make us feel better. really undermines your long-term relationship with the child. So you got to have to learn how to sit with the pain. And it's brutal. It's hard, but it's not as hard for you as it is for them. And just by sitting with them and being able to be present in their pain and not undoing it, you, over time, that will diminish the pain for them and it will make it easier for you. And so that's the key thing, is remember, it's a process. It's no matter what you read, no matter what people tell you, there's not a thing that you will do that will make this, oh, this is what we do with kids who lose a parent. We do X. There's no, it's a process. And those things that we tell you, like we'll send you a thing about how, how to talk with kids. That's something that is just sort of this broad framework, right? The reality is so different. And it will be a little bit different for each child, depending upon how the parent was lost, how old the child is, how often you get to see them, how much they trust you. But again, the key thing here, and this is so important, you need to recognize that in moments like this, the contagion of affect is so powerful that if you go into this interaction, make sure that you feel comfortable, that you feel regulated, you are, don't hold yourself to some unrealistic level of expertise that you can't live up to. Give yourself a break and say, listen, this is hard human stuff. I'm not going to be perfect at this. I don't know what to say. I'm just going to be with you. And if you just be an open, compassionate human being and let your professional expertise filter in, as opposed to enter the interaction as a professional and let your humanity filter in, you'll be fine. Does that make sense? So first of all, just be a good human. Your professional stuff will help you as you go. But if you go in as this like professional, that's not going to have the same impact as if you go in as a compassionate, caring person. Anyway, that's the advice I have for that. But I got to go see the doctor. We'll keep that. We'll post this recording. We'll work with all y'all. We'll set up another time to visit. And thank you for all you're doing. And I'm looking forward to getting to know some of you. Thank you, Ibrahim. Good work. You are the best. That's okay. Yeah, that's okay. People always get us mixed up, And I just need the only way you need to remember that I'm the good-looking one.